Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I think I can hear myself. You can hear me as well.
Yeah.
Welcome back to College of the Atlantic. This is our weekly coffee and conversation session. So great to see so many of you. My name is Sean Keeley. I'm a graduate of COA and also the director of the Summer Institute these days. So plenty of familiar faces, but I want to just say a few things about College of the Atlantic for folks who might be new, because I don't recognize everyone. So COA has been around for a little while. This coming September, we're going to start our 54th academic year, which is a wonderful, not a big milestone, but every year matters to keep this thing in human ecology going. And what we are is a group of really learners and doers. We're about 350 undergraduate students, all pursuing a degree in human ecology. It takes an interdisciplinary approach to education and brings a lot of different perspectives, disciplines to all kinds of challenges we face or things that we just want to better understand to ultimately improve the world. Conservation has always been just central to a lot of what we care about, protecting the natural world, really making our environment a better place. So our conversation this morning is right in our COA wheelhouse, I would say. So happy to have Karin, you joining us this morning, and Ken here as well. And back in January, at the Jessup Library, a group of mostly year-rounders joined Karin for her first talk, I believe, on this book called Loving the North Woods. And it was a wonderful evening, and she sort of took us through this remarkable 25-year period of conservation in northern Maine. So I learned a lot. I also had a lot of reflections of things that I remember happening in, sort of the 2000s. These important steps in preserving some of the North Woods. Anyhow, it was a wonderful evening, and sorry, I just lost my train of thought, friends. Oh, I had two thoughts that night. One, we got to bring Karin to COA to do this talk. And two, we've got to have Ken as our interlocutor, because there's really no one better to do this conversation or to help kind of paint the picture and lead the conversation than Ken. And I'll let Ken, you say a few words about Karin as we get started, but I do want to thank you personally for doing this.
Sure.
Ken's been teaching at the college since 1989. So going back a little while,
Yep.
and when I was here as a student, he was my advisor. So I owe him immense gratitude, a lifetime of gratitude. And he's known for teaching environmental law and policy. He's known for his love of rivers and paddling and his deep knowledge of rivers and paddling, and also for his work to protect the environment, not just through here at COA, but also through a number of groups like Sierra Club in Maine and things like that. So before I turn it over, just a couple things to cover. Please silence your cell phones if you don't mind. Also, this book, Loving the North Woods, we have a stack of them in the back, and afterwards we'll make those available for purchase, and Karin can do some signing. And lastly, I want to thank all of our donors, and at the risk of sounding a little bit like a broken record, these events like this and our remarkable education in human ecology is made possible because of all of you who support the college. So thank you so much. Over the last few weeks, we've had a number of people join our Champlain Society who really enjoyed the Summer Institute. And whether you can contribute at that level or really any amount that you can contribute to the college, please consider it. Please join us. This is a remarkable community to be a part of. And I think with that went a little long, but Ken, I'm turning it over to you and getting out of
Great.
here.
Thanks, Sean. Zach, does this sound good? Okay, perfect. One of the advantages of being around here for so long is you actually get to watch your former students go off and do amazing things and come back and compliment you and things like that as you give presentations. So thanks, Sean. It's good to have you do this. And it's wonderful to be here. Karin, welcome to COA. This is fun.
Oh, amazing to be here.
Yeah, and now you're in the neighborhood. We just need to get you here a little bit more. As Sean mentioned, I came to Maine in 1989 to teach at the college, and Karin was one of the first people I met in the conservation community here. So in some ways, reading her book was a lot like sort of revisiting the 36 years that I've been here, and it's very fun. So as a starting point, this book is about the North Woods, and hopefully many people, and I know some of you who've spent time in the North Woods, but it'd be great if you could just tell us a little bit, what is the North Woods? You use that term. What does it mean? What do you think about when you when you write about it and think about it?
Well, first of all, thank you. And Sean, thank you for having me here and inviting me. And thank all of you for being here on a beautiful sunny day to take an interest in Maine's Great North Woods. I'm going to show a map here. Hopefully you can see it. Maine is a little over 20 million acres, and the North Woods, which is generally, it's an informal term, but it's about informally considered 12 million acres. And you can see Baxter Park there in the light green, which gives you a point of reference, right in the heart there of the state of the North Woods. And the orange line is the state of Connecticut. And you can fit 3.5 times the size of Connecticut in Maine's North Woods. And I think we forget how immense this part of Maine is. We typically live in the coastal to central area. There's a lot of land up there. And for those who may not be that familiar with the North Woods, about 9 million acres of that area is unorganized, which means there are no towns. There's no municipal government. There are no public roads in much of that area. It's mostly privately owned land and has been for a long time. I'm going to just mention a couple aspects of it to give you a sense of how important it is. The area that is in red with the green spots, the area itself is deemed globally important by the National Audubon for migratory songbird habitat. So I start with this because what we have in the North Woods is globally significant, important for migratory songbirds, but also for iconic wildlife species, moose, marten. It's a last stronghold of wild native eastern brook trout. Very abundant with many species that have typically been in the North Woods, remain there and remain in have healthy populations. But the fact that Maine's North Woods is globally significant for migratory songbirds is notable because, and for those of you who are involved in academic research around wildlife, a recent study by Dr. John Hagan compared bird life in the North Woods from 2 years ago compared to 30 years ago. And most of the species were either at the same level or had increased in population. And that's in stark contrast with the rest of the country and many places around the world. This place is really important for a lot of reasons, and wildlife is really one of them. I'll also quickly mention, and you've got to stop me because I'll get going here, but major rivers start here, and you're a river guy. But we have major rivers that originate in the North Woods, the Androscoggin, the Kennebec, the Penobscot, the St. John, the Allagash, and I'm probably forgetting the St. Croix, and smaller ones as well. And they connect to the ocean. They connect to us here. And I think we sometimes think of the coast and then the North Woods. But a lot of species are moving up and down these rivers, the Atlantic salmon being a good example. Many of you have heard of Katahdin Ironworks in that area, not far from just south of Baxter. Atlantic salmon now are able to move up from the coast up to that area and are laying eggs again because there has been passage created that now from the ocean to the Penobscot to the Piscataquis to the West Branch of the Pleasant and now up to Gulf Hagus. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And so, you know, our former commissioner, Pat Kelleher of DMR, Department of Marine Resources, said Atlantic salmon are a creature of the forest.
Mhm.
And the nutrients that come from the woods nourish the streams, nourish our coastal environment. So even if you consider yourself a coastal person, you're connected to the Great North Woods. They're also important for other reasons. It's the darkest sky east of the Mississippi, the Great North Woods. And it's the least fragmented forest east of the Mississippi. And I'm just going to read this because I haven't been able to memorize it. The North Woods are the largest, most intact, contiguous, temperate forest in North America, perhaps globally, that has remained continuously forested since pre-settlement times. I mean, this is a huge fact that it's been continuously forested, which is why I think we have the wildlife habitat and the clean water and, you know, rivers that are becoming healthier and more robust. So those are some of the reasons.
Okay. That's a good start, and I think we'll probably talk about more. I mean, if you noted the title of Karin's book, The Loving the North Woods, you'll see that. You'll certainly see it in her writing, but you can hear it now. This isn't just an academic treatise. This is kind of a multi-decade love affair, and hopefully we'll explore that. I guess getting into that, just a little bit about your background and how you came to be involved in land conservation in Maine. I think when we first met, you were an attorney for Maine Audubon and already doing, you know, forest-related stuff then. But I'd love for the group to hear a little bit about what you did before that got you there, and then just some of the things afterwards that, you know, drew you to this place and the passion that you have for it.
Well, as many of you may have experienced as a child, I connected with the outdoors, and that is such a formative time for people generally. I just would bolt out the doors and play outside in a little wooded piece. My parents were not outdoorsy people, but I found my way with an outdoor club, Girl Scouts, and other things. I think for me, I studied biology. I had a wonderful high school biology teacher, Mr. Carbone, who saw in me a person who really loved biology and encouraged that. So never underestimate the importance of teaching when you're young people. And that led me to study biology and then wildlife biology. But it was a summer course with the National Outdoor Leadership School in Wyoming on the Absaroka Mountain Range, where at the end of the trip, we had, at that point, 4 days of fasting. I don't know if they still do that. But as we had started that painful process, I was sleeping outside one night and the moon was full. And I kind of had this burning vision, if you will, that being involved in conservation and the out of doors was my inner compass. And so that had a profound effect on me. And then I was fortunate after college to get a job in Washington, D.C., working on the Alaska Lands Bill. This is the bill that created all the national parks and wildlife refuges, and also was supported by Native people, Native tribes in Alaska for also helping settle tribal lands. But that experience of working on national legislation at a time when actually parties worked together across the aisle. This was during Jimmy Carter's time, and Mo Udall was the bill sponsor, and it was amazing. Senator Chafee was a big sponsor. That showed me that you could do things, and it led me to go to law school. And that's what led me to law. And pairing science and law has been a profoundly wonderful opportunity for me to do conservation work at Maine Audubon. I work for state government as a Department of Conservation Deputy Commissioner, and for Governor Baldacci as a Deputy Commissioner, and for the Northern Forest Alliance. And the most recently, I've been with the Forest Society of Maine for 14 years and was the president for 7 and just retired. So that's a quick overview. But the teaching, you know, paying attention, if you see someone who's interested in, just having a little bit of encouragement makes such a difference.
Oh, great. No, that's
Oh, and then, I'm sorry,
okay.
but the punchline is that after Washington, D.C., I got a job teaching backpacking in the North Woods.
That's right.
And for an organization called the International Backpackers Association, big name, tiny group,
Yeah.
very tiny. But I led a few groups down the Appalachian Trail over the course of that summer. And it just was home. I found home for me. And that was a soul home, if you will. And it is for many. So I'm not saying I'm special or unique, but it has been my place ever since.
No, that's great, because I think you get the sense in the book, but also knowing you is you know this place. You don't just know it from maps or from a policy briefing or something like that. You've been out on most of the major rivers, fly fishing, canoeing, camping. You've probably driven, I don't even want to guess our combined carbon footprint, but so many miles on logging roads, and have hiked and really experienced it. And that's part of, that comes through in the book, but I think also just in your work, there's a difference between somebody thinking about this as in the abstract and somebody who just really knows it. So I guess I mentioned the book, and there's a lot different ways we can go, but why? What made you write it at this point?
Well, what I believe to be a historic moment in Maine's history, certainly, but I think American conservation history took place from about 1990 to 2010, 2015. And I experienced that you were experiencing it here, and a number of the people that I mentioned in the book were part of it, and many of all of our community experiences, but it didn't seem like it had been chronicled. And so I did start talking to people about, maybe there should be a way to chronicle this. And eventually, people said, well, why don't you try?
Of course.
I'm not an author. I'm not an academic journalist, historian. And I really struggled with that idea. But I don't know if any of you read John McPhee's books, but what I found about his books, he is an author and a scientist and a wonderful writer, but what he would put himself in the books as stories, and the idea of storytelling kind of made me feel like, well, maybe I can do this. And it took about 8 years. So, yeah.
It's good. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that your friends told you to do it. It's nice to have it. It's also, it's not only to chronicle it, but also to celebrate it. And we can talk a little bit more about why it's so significant. But in some ways, a lot of this was done quietly and away from, I mean, there were big battles, there were referenda, there were, fights in the legislature, but there was also a lot that just was happening on the ground. And sometimes that gets overlooked. So I guess to set the stage, when I moved here in '89, the Maine woods looked quite different than what they do now, not just in terms of plants, but in terms of who owned the land, how the land was being used. And that I didn't realize that at the time, and you never really realized the moment, but that was sort of an inflection point in some ways. But can you tell us a little bit about what life in the Maine woods was like in that sort of period up to the late '80s, early '90s?
Yeah, so imagine yourself, living here in the early 1980s, 70s, 80s. Most of the North Woods, so that 12 million acres, were owned by just a dozen or maybe 15 landowners. That's it. And those were mostly paper company ownerships. There were a few family ownerships, the Pingree family being an example, Baskehegan being an example. But most of these, this Northwoods ownership were owned by companies such as International Paper or Champion International, Georgia Pacific, Scott Paper, Great Northern Paper. These were companies that would own about 1 million acres. Great Northern owned 2.3 million acres. And it was privately owned. They had accumulated land over a century or more. They were managing their woodlands typically to supply paper mills and some lumber mills. Most of the mills were also powered by hydroelectric that the companies owned. And this is a term you may hear. Many of the companies were vertically integrated, meaning they owned mills, they owned the land to supply the mills, and they owned energy. And they could make paper or make lumber in some cases. But this was the way it was. And communities had around the North Woods had workers that worked either in the woods as loggers, foresters, managers. Many in the communities were truckers or involved in the mills. Many thousands of people worked in the mills, thousands. It was a huge part of Maine's economy, this forest products sector. And it had been this way for decades or 100 years, growing sort of stable. And we all thought this is, the way it was. The companies managed their woodlands a little different from each other, but not vastly different. They were managing for wood fiber to service their mills. And so that's the way it was. And then suddenly, and I really can't even convey adequately the shock of this. In less than 10 years, 10 million acres of that ownership was sold. And it happened boom, boom, boom. And can I just read one or two excerpts? Yeah. Because this was the only way I could figure out how to do this. And I'm just going to read a few excerpts here, but it started in the mid to late 1980s. And Kathy Johnson, by the way, was working at NRCM, and I was working for the Northern Forest Alliance, and we had an office there. Kathy is one of the first graduates, or came from the first graduating class here, and was incredibly instrumental in a lot of this forest conservation. So she and I started keeping track of all of the announcements in the newspapers. On June 3rd, 1998, Sappi Fine Paper North America announced that it placed all of its Maine timber holdings of a net 911,000 acres on the market. It had acquired this timber ownership only a few years earlier from Scott Paper Company. On October 6, 1998, Plum Creek Timber Company announced its plan to buy 905,000 acres from Sappi. On October 19, 1998, South Carolina-based Bowater, formerly Great Northern Paper, announced it would explore selling a substantial amount of its 2 million acres in Maine and its mills as a package. On October 21, 1998, Bowater announced that it was selling 911,000 acres of timberland and a sawmill to J.D. Irving. On October 2nd, 1998, Bowater announced that it was selling 656,000 acres of Maine forest land to McDonald Investment Company. On December 15, 1998, International Paper sold 185,000 acres of its remote forest land. On February 24, 1999, IP announced its intention to sell another 245,000 acres of its land in northern Maine. On April 1999, Georgia Pacific announced that it was selling 446,000 acres of forest land in Washington County to investors. On July 1999, it was reported that Bowater Inc. would sell approximately 390,000 acres of forest land in Maine to an ex-con of Quebec, Canada. And so really, I've started in June of 1998 and ended there July of 1999, just over a year. That all happened in a year, and I list more. And this was boom, boom, boom. And no one understood what was happening. The legislature, workers, communities, like, what is going on here? Why is this happening? What are the implications? Forest economists like Lloyd Erlin wrote, no one, including himself, saw it coming. It was a remarkable sell-off of forest lands in Maine And it was about 9.1 million acres in a decade were sold, or in 34 transactions. So what was going to happen? And what about the economy, the jobs at the mills, the jobs in the communities, the fish and wildlife, and the traditions? And so one thing I haven't talked about really is Maine has this tremendous tradition of public access to wildlands, to open woodlands and open lands that goes way back. And the paper companies honored that. And people could go on the land and hunt and fish and explore. And they kept the land open for people. And many jobs were associated with that. We have a strong outdoor economy too, and had that then. And people had affection. You know, I expressed my affection for the Northwoods, but so many people had relationship to this place, and generations of their family members did as well. And now, you know, what was going to happen? And so the question I always get at this point is like, why?
Yeah.
Should I answer that?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you.
Why did this happen? So there were forces at work that came together in a rather remarkable fashion to prompt this sell-off. So first was really the peaking of the demand for paper we had peaked, and it was starting to decline worldwide. Also, there was competition from other countries with paper making. China, for example, had very large new paper making facilities, and our mills were getting old and perhaps hadn't been retrofitted or invested in sufficiently to match that competition. Another really significant factor was there was a 1986 Tax Reform Act that changed how capital gains on forest lands there had been a favorable tax treatment for C corporations for the gains on forest land, and that was changed. And so for the paper companies that were typically C corporations, they were getting double taxed on the gains of forest land, both at the corporate level and the investor level. And so forest land was becoming a drag in their views and to their economic well-being. It was considered a non-performing asset. It was just there, all this land. And yes, it supplied wood to the mills, but there was a growing belief that they could buy wood on the market. They didn't need to have all this land and all the expense going, to maintain the forest land and the roads and manage it. And so all of these forces came together, and it was, I think, a little bit of like peer. There was a peer thing going on. Diamond Occidental started to do leverage buyouts and then sell forest land, break it up and sell it. That was across the northern forest. And it was like everyone was looking at what their other paper companies were doing. I think the economists and the managers, and decisions were made to sell. And it happened very quickly, really, in 5 to 10 years. It was amazing. And so at the end of that period, really, there weren't any more paper company ownerships. There was still some family ownerships, but not the paper company ownerships. And so there was fear. Should I talk about the fear now?
Yeah, and then talking to the communities. I mean, it's saying who may have bought them, because that ties into the fear, because
Yeah.
we'd had this one model, and land certainly sold in Maine in the Northwoods over those prior decades, but it usually was sold to other paper companies,
Yes.
right? But things are a little bit different here, and I think that gets into the fear and uncertainty.
Yeah, that's an important point, Ken. Paper companies sometimes would sell to each other to consolidate or kind of clump their ownerships or have land closer to mills by trading. But they weren't selling to developers. They weren't selling to conservation groups. They were just really, if anything, amassing forest land. And so when this land went on the market, the question is who bought it? And so there are a number of different kinds of buyers. One group of buyers are called Timber Investment Management Organizations, or TIMOs. And these are investment groups of pooled investors. So if we took all of you and you each put in a ton of money, we could create a TIMO and you could buy forest land. And it could be managed by a manager and you would get rates of return from that. And that's a simplified version of a TIMO. And so these were investor owners that were being pooled and buying forest land. And people didn't know what were their intentions. Are they going to hold it for a long time, or manage it over decades, or is it for a quick rate of return? No one knew. We had no experience with them in Maine. There was one real estate investment trust, a REIT, and that was Plum Creek Timber Company, who bought about 1 million acres, and that they bought from Sappi. And that a REIT is designed to do some development. And so that was a concern to many people in the communities around the lands that they acquired. We also had some individuals buy forest land. Some of you may have heard of John Malone. He is a very large landowner throughout the country. It may be the largest landowner, private individual landowner. He and his trust own about 1 million acres in Maine, and he bought a number of parcels over that were on the market here. And a group called PCW, which is a family, but now they are the largest landowner in the Northwoods. Some of you have probably eaten at Subway sandwich shops.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, the Buck family, Dr. Peter Buck, was one of the early investors and owners of the Subway. And over time, he and his family acquired 1.3 million acres in Maine. And then we had Irving Woodlands from Irving, from New Brunswick, Canada. And they are also at about 1.3 million acres. But it was probably the TIMOs and the REITs that really, people didn't know, are they going to divide these hundreds of thousands of acres and sell lots around the thousands of ponds, really thousands of ponds? And though if the lots are sold, will the land be gated and posted? Will they lose the wildness of this place, the intactness? Remember that quote, the intact, continuously forested east of the Mississippi, perhaps globally. There's something so rare about that intactness. And people felt this fear, like what was going to happen, and could they have any control over this? And it was a time of chaos and fear. And I don't know if you want me to say a word or two about the Northern Forest Land Study at all.
I think maybe just to give a context, because this isn't just happening in Maine. It's happening across the Northeast. Well, in some ways happening across the country, but definitely across the Northeast. And you were really involved in that, in sort of that regional thing. That might be worth talking about.
Well, I'll mention that, as Ken, you say, that a number of these companies also had lands in Vermont, New Hampshire, New York, and across the northern tier. But particularly those 4 states, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, had this tradition, this economy, this way of life that people felt was at risk. And so U.S. Congress got involved and initially created a Northern Forest Land Study to look at options and what was going on and why. And that wasn't really deemed enough to provide guidance. So then Congress created a Northern Forest Lands Council, and the governors each appointed 4 members from each of their states to that. And that took 4 more years of research and public outreach and involvement. And so after 6 years of study, a report came out that was helpful. But it was more the process that was helpful, that people engaged with each other. There were some that wanted the whole place to become a national public lands. And there was some that didn't want any kind of conservation. And it was hard. It was hard. There was, as someone said, the long knives were out,
Probably scars somewhere.
Yeah,
on my-
and but what's ironic in a way is that whatever your position was, it was because you cared for something that you were fearing that you would lose. And eventually that became more obvious than everything else. And that fact that there was common ground and how we could work together to hold on to these values and this place. And I think a lot of the recommendations that came out of that, particularly the easements and the funding, really did help with some of these grand projects that emerged.
And I think one of the other things that happened coming out of that process is sort of a recognition that this area was nationally important.
Yeah.
I mean, the conservation we'll talk about in a second, was driven from here, but there was a lot of attention nationwide and said, this place is intact. Nature doesn't just exist, west of the Mississippi. There are some real important values that could be lost here, which I think helped certainly with gathering money, but interest and political support for some of what came. So maybe since I'm sort of aware that Sean's gonna say, okay, you only have so much time left. This is like reminiscing over, our lives here. We went from 5% of the land in conservation in the early 90s to almost 20% by the time, sort of the end period in terms of your book. And that happened with a bunch of projects, and your book really profiles those. I think you give 7 chapters, and each chapter talks about some of these just major conservation efforts. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of those. You were involved in many of them. There were a whole cast of characters that were involved, and you're really generous in your book in terms of acknowledging what it took for this to happen. But just to give the audience a sense of, with that transition, because we had this, I think what you called the unimaginable happen, and then there was a response to it that I think from a conservation point of view is a success story.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, so the map now shows the public or conserved lands in 1990. And it was about 5% of Maine. Maine was at the bottom of the barrel in terms of public ownership across the country at that time. We had this heritage of private land. And then this is what it looked like around 2010. All of the colors represent some form of legal permanent conservation, and that's just North Woods. During this time, there was also wonderful efforts going on along, with local land trusts too. So as Ken mentioned, I profiled 7 really important projects that emerged from the land sales. And that's really what I focused on, those that came out of these land sales. And they each had their own flavor. And it would take a while for me to go over, each of the projects. But, just some of the factors that I quickly identified. One, underneath it was people that loved this place didn't just sit idly by. They took the time to develop what they wanted to hold on to. They met with each other in these communities like Jackman, Greenville, Grand Lake Stream, Millinocket, around Bethel area, Rangeley, around they're called gateway communities around the North Woods, and talk to each other over coffee and donuts. And I was involved as a Northern Forest Alliance person. Ken, you were involved in Sierra Club, Karen Woodsome and others. People were meeting with their colleagues, their neighbors, to say, what do we want to make sure we hold on to? So the message I hope comes out of the book is, if you care, you can make a difference. And these various groups developed visions, whether it was a community group, friends of groups. There was a Friends of Moosehead Lake, Friends of Boundary Mountains, Friends of Bald Mountain Pond, Friends of Grand Lake Stream, Friends of, I'm forgetting 1 or 2, I think. But they all developed a vision of what they wanted to hold on to and what they didn't want to lose. And then they met with their local legislators or met with the landowner, worked together to promote their vision. And so the response was critical, and it gave politicians cover. It wasn't top-down government, it was ground up from the people, from those that hunted and fished or worked or lived and loved this place. But each project had its own moments of almost failure. And I really mean that. Like, each project almost failed. The St. John project, the TNC made a bid with an investor group, and they came in third. And they're like, oh, well, I guess we lost. But the number one bidder left. They couldn't pull the money together. The number two investor or bidder left because they saw that number one bidder had won, and they went elsewhere with their money. And TNC and its investor were suddenly called and said, well, you can do this if you can raise the money in like 2 months, or it was a very short period of time.
Short.
Yeah. And by that time, their partner had left. So they had to like pledge millions of dollars in a very short period of time. But they, it was kind of a happenstance so that the other two bidders walked. Down East project was just grunt work. So, the flavor of that to me was just a group of local small businessmen and women and fishermen and guides and some folks from the Passamaquoddy guides were there. Just probably with very modest incomes, decided, yep, we're going to raise $30 million and do this, and worked so hard for that project. The West Branch of the Penobscot was more tumultuous. It was more in a public stage, and there was advocacy groups that were pushing to make it stronger, and the landowner didn't want to make it stronger, and it was not easy. It wasn't sugar and cookies, it was a sort of some conflict there. And then the Plum Creek easement came out of a very conflict-ridden lake concept plan. A quirky thing happened, though, after the lake concept plan was finally approved and this 356,000 acre permanent easement was established. The subsequent owner, Weyerhaeuser, decided they didn't want to pursue the lake concept plan, and they had it terminated. So now we just have the easement.
Yeah, because the lake concept plan would have allowed development around Moosehead Lake in certain places, and yeah.
2,000 units.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was like quirky and kind of wild. So I just mentioned a few factors to, give you a sense that each has its own flavor and taste and difficulty and challenge and quality that, I tried to capture. And there's so many people that work so hard, people that are hidden behind, well, first of all, we had wonderful politicians that worked for federal funding, state funding. We had people that were so generous of their own financial resources, took huge risks, hard work. I would say, if anything, it's hard work. These things went on for years. Many of them were 5-year efforts. The 100-mile wilderness project that AMC led was a mix of good luck and happenstance and real risk-taking by AMC, Appalachian Mountain Club. And, they just initially bought 37,000, but now they own over 100,000 acres in the 100-mile wilderness stretch of the Appalachian Trail and manage it beautifully, partly ecological reserve, partly sustainable forestry, and have a series of lodges that you can ski to or hike to or bicycle to over the seasons. So I can't, it would take too much time to talk about it, but politically, and I would say what made these work is that they were rooted in the traditions of Maine, that commitment to public access for everyone, to ensure that things weren't posted and gated, and that wildlife would be habitat would be considered. And they're not perfect. There's, people, wish some of them were stronger and whatnot, but they're not developed. There's not water slide parks on them. There's not, huge water extraction companies. There's not commercial, centers for AI. I'm trying to think of, they're intact forest lands. So in that sense, they were highly successful in stabilizing Maine's Northwoods.
And I would say, I mean, it's hard because Maine is so vast. These things may not look as big as they are, but these are landscape scale conservation efforts. Those of you, and I know some of you work with land trusts and you get a 300-acre parcel and it's a major victory. These are hundreds of thousands of acres of land that is put in permanent conservation in some way. And, in many ways, it was unprecedented. Very different than the public land ownership in the West, both in terms of the amount of money raised and the kind of conservation that was happening. I guess one of the other things that your book stresses that I sometimes, being in the trenches, forgot is the degree to which, you mentioned TNC, which is the Nature Conservancy. There are a lot of different players involved in these, and they, for the most part, played really well together. There was a real cooperative effort that, and part of that is not taking, having to take credit for everything. Part of it is people had, different groups had different strengths that they brought to the table. And then, people like you were in key positions that helped leverage government or other organizations. I know we're about to run out of time. I want to make sure that the audience can ask some questions. So I'm just wondering, looking at this map, and you've just retired, so you continued to work on these things post 2015. What are some of the opportunities or places as you look in that and say, there's not a color up there, we need another block? What does the next generation, there's some young people here, some of my students, what should they be working on? What are the opportunities?
Well, yeah, first of all, we're overall in the state now at 23% of Maine has some form of permanent conservation. And that's local land trusts, state government, some federal ownerships, these easement properties in many cases. And the goal is that the state has adopted is 30%.
Right.
And forests is sort of underscored as in a report by Maine Won't Wait. Maine's Climate Council produced 2 reports in the last 4 or 5 years. And forests is a key part of that getting to 30%. And Maine's forests sequester 91% of our annual greenhouse gas emissions. And that's all of our forests in Maine. So it's more than just the North Woods. It's all of the forests, like the trees out here. But if you take all of our woodlands in Maine, they're sequestering and storing 91% of our greenhouse gases every year. And we need to hold on to them if we can. So at a general level, anytime we have an opportunity to work with a landowner in the North Woods, we've got to jump. And that's a quality I meant to mention, being ready with science, with organizations collaborating, being ready when a landowner says, yeah, okay, I'd like to work on a project. I would like to see, a lot more of the North Woods stabilized with some form of conservation. I think they're all ongoing conversations all the time with the large landowners. Hopefully there'll be opportunities, but I will mention as an example, the McGalloway project, because it's an example that there's still opportunities to do big stuff in the North Woods. This shows, you can see the Maine, New Hampshire line there, and you can see the green represents all the conserved land. This project, 78,000 acres, would fill that gap with a combination of wilderness acquisition of about 12,000 acres, highly well-managed restoration of about 5,000 or 6,000 acres, and a strong conservation easement of 62,000 acres. And that just gives a sense. The brown is the wilderness component that Northeast Wilderness Trust will hold. The orange is restoration lands along the Little McGalloway and a portion of the McGalloway watershed by the Rangeley Lakes Heritage Trust will own and manage. And then all of the green will be have a permanent conservation easement with very strong stream corridor protections. that will have no harvesting on them, which I was involved in negotiating it, so I'm particularly happy about that. But 78,000 acres, and it's ongoing. And those groups, Forest Society, the Nature Conservancy of Maine is playing a leadership role in organizing it, Rangeley Lakes Heritage Trust, and Northeast Wilderness Trust. And it's an example of collaboration. These groups started working together with the landowner 3 years ago to negotiate it. And again, talking about time, things just take time. And now the fundraising campaign is underway. So if you're interested in learning more, you could just go to the McGalloway.com, I think, or any of those organizations would have it on their website. But there's still opportunities, and we need to be ready for them. And we need to understand what the landowners, they're changing. There's still land being sold. I'm working quietly with a couple landowners on 17,000 acre projects in my retirement, just quietly with some conservation.
In your spare time.
My candy. And so that's there to be had. But working with the landowners, there was a tendency for us all to be like distrustful and angry, which is understandable given the rate of change. But ultimately, talking to the landowner and understanding what their needs are, even if you may not be perfectly in alignment with them, and then figuring out, well, how could we do conservation here and make it work? It's not easy, though.
And I know I want to leave a little bit of time for questions, but there's an aspect of your book that isn't apparent and ties directly into the Loving the Northwoods, is that you actually wrote poetry. Would you be willing to read one of your poems to the group? That'd be great.
Is the
river
river
one, yeah, the river one would be my favorite, but that's my orientation.
So I do love fly fishing, and I started rather late in life fly fishing, but this poem is about a river in the Great Northwoods, and it's called Do You Know This River? There is a place where trees tilt toward river water, the trees with leaves that fall patiently, spinning yellow, green, a bit of red, the river that bends out of sight, taunting us to discover what lies beyond. Strong fish live here, secreted. They wait for food, they wait to spawn. If you catch one, they give you their magic. It is so powerful that it breaks open your heart, and joy and sorrow come tumbling out, joining the relentless current. I stay by the river, watching. A late season duck mirrored in the water, feathers holding the colors of autumn. Grass stems delicate like fine steel, precise edges of pine needles. I wonder at this new ability to see. I hear the voices of my friends, rich tones deep and calming in harmony with river sound. My line catches the altar behind me, and I am back in the day. Do you know this river?
Nice. Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions, Sean, so
Yes, and I'll just ask people to speak into the mic and be brief if you can.
that was nice, Ken.
Thank you for your talk. Morning. You mentioned the Irving holdings. Could you comment on the interests of Canadian people, Canadian companies, Canadian nonprofits, and the Canadian government in Maine's northern forest? How has it changed over your career?
Well, I think a place I'd start is that while I was at the Forest Society of Maine, Irving Woodlands submitted a lake concept plan for the Fish River chain of lakes in Aroostook County. And this is a chain of lakes, and they own quite a bit of land around it. This would be Square Lake and Cross Lake and a few other of the lakes. And a lake concept plan, as we talked earlier, enables a little more development than you would normally be able to have under LURC or LUPSI zoning, but you have to show then in balance some conservation that would balance that additional development or concentration of development. And so I worked with Irving staff on that in the LUPSI process. And I think it is, I think, their first conservation easement. And it was a process. It took a while. And of course, over time, you kind of get to know what the thinking is and the values are. And I can't really extend my experience too much beyond that for them. I will say that in the end, we were very pleased with the conservation easement that came out of that process that really protects I think it was 17,000 acres, if I'm remembering correctly, from development in really the key places. But what I really valued was we worked with, and this is an example, groups like Maine Audubon and NRCM and TNC supplied information about the migration of moose and other animals from those lakes to Canada. And they were open to designing the easement in a way that would try to have transportation corridors. So I give them a recognition for their openness, because in the beginning, the easement didn't do, like, it was not a good easement in the beginning, in my opinion. I think that there are conservation groups on both country borders. There's a group called Two Borders, One Tree, or something like that.
One forest,
One
maybe?
forest.
Yeah, two countries, one forest.
That I know is trying to work with conservation and advocacy groups in Maine. We also, again, I can only speak from my experience doing conservation at FSM, but we worked with a landowner on Coburn Gore, which is right on the Quebec border, and there are a number of Quebec conservation lands across the border. So again, building corridors of conservation. I'm not going to get into the relationship between the countries right now, but I do believe that there's efforts to communicate, and have been for decades, with conservation groups across the countries. I hope that is helpful.
Yeah. And it's hard. I mean, there are mills on the Canadian side for saw
Right.
timber and things like that are supplied from Maine and some vice versa. And that is complicated by what's going on right now.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about how the tribes were involved in this remarkable conservation effort.
Yes. So this was at a time, really 1980s to 90s, when there wasn't as much collaboration on design of projects. And I think that has really improved. During my tenure at Forest Society of Maine, we instituted a much more, I think, warm and collaborative process as we were approached by landowners who might want to do projects. We would reach out to the tribes in Maine to see if there were their interest in the land, any portages, archaeological or cultural, ceremonial sites, and we would work to try to incorporate their wishes and work together. And sometimes we've even started thinking about some co-management. That's more the last 10, 15 years. At this time, though, I think, and this gives me some pleasure, some of these older projects, these older easements, again, as I was finishing my time at Forest Society of Maine, we started working with the landowners and tribes who had land nearby to meet in the forest and talk about the conserved lands and to build new relationships. And that's possible with much of the language of the easement. So I think that it's stronger and better, in my opinion, the collaboration and involvement. So thank you for that question.
We'll take one more if someone has a question. Right up here.
Obviously, a lot of jobs disappeared when this be when the paper mills got rid of everything in the woods, whatever. Have there been accommodations to the people who live in these areas? Has there been any compensation or new industry coming in that has helped them to give jobs to the people who live in the area who didn't have a way of making a living anymore?
So the land was sold, from 1990 to, 2000. Many of the paper mills continued beyond that time. And so we've had a slow loss now of paper mills that was a lag. So it was like a 20-year lag, really,
Right.
between when the paper company land was sold and then the slow demise of paper mills. We still have a few paper mills in Maine that are going, and some are doing well and continue to invest. But the Penobscot River, for example, used to be lined with paper mills, and really they're pretty well gone. And so I would say that it's been a hard transition for many workers as the mills slowly, especially like the Millinocket and East Millinocket area, were sold and then closed down. And these were large corporate ownerships. So it, and they would slowly lay off people over time. So it was a slow death by many cuts. And I think that some communities have found new ways to respond to that. There have been massive efforts by leaders in Maine and also forest product sector leaders. There's an effort called For Maine, FOR, capital letters, Maine, to invest in and do research for new kinds of products made from fiber. So I don't know if you've heard of Tan Bark, but it's a company that makes like containers for food out of fiber, but really nice high-end ones and machines that make them. There's biochemicals that would be made from the resins of fiber. There's a fiber insulation company, HP, out of Madison, that is up and running. And then mass timber, which is timber made from smaller pieces of wood, but made really strongly, so you can make like multi-story buildings out of mass timber. And some on the campus maybe.
There is, I would say our new dorm is mass
So
timber.
hooray. So there are major efforts to continue to have products coming from a fiber and build small businesses and businesses around it. And I'm going to say something that it kind of took me, it's hard to say and it's hard to understand maybe, but having a strong fiber economy is a form of conservation. And so let me explain why I say that. Let's say each of you own 300,000 acres of woodland. You might want to manage your forests for, wood products. Maybe some do go to lumber mills. Some might go to a couple of the remaining paper mills. Maybe some go to these smaller products. But you've got to pay taxes, and it's under tree growth, so they're not huge, but you've got that. Roads are increasingly expensive to maintain because you're getting stronger, more powerful storm events. Fish passage is something a lot of landowners are trying to improve under culverts. That's very expensive. And the management is getting harder because the number of days you can work in the forest is decreasing because of climate change. Usually you would do a lot of harvesting in the winter when the ground's frozen so as to not disturb the soils. If there's strong forest economy, you have a reason to hold on to your forest land and not develop it. But if you're like, oh, I'm just losing money, I'm going to divide it. I'm going to divide that 300,000 acres into 20 pieces, sell it off, and sell those lakefront shores. I mean, so it's kind of important to have every bit of effort to hold on to. We've got to hold on to this. This is our Amazon. So everything that it causes a landowner to not develop and divide it for as long as possible is good, in my opinion. And conservation, of course, is best, permanent. Yeah.
That's a great way to end. Thank you, Karen. Thanks for doing that.
Thank you all. Thank you.
And you will sign books over there, is that my understanding? Well,
I just-
I'll let the MC take
Can I
over.
just say one thing? I meant to
Sure.
mention Bill Ginn, he also graduated with Kathy. And
Yes.
Bill Ginn was a mastermind of some of the creative, very complex funding for some of these conservation deals and new markets tax credits that people could study for months and not understand.
Understand,
Yeah.
no.
Thank you.
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you so much. And I'll just say, yes, books on the back table, Karen, if we can get you over there soon, that'd be great. And next week, come on back. We've got 2 more sessions, if I'm counting correctly. Next week, we'll have Dan Fahrenkopf with us. Dan is a COA alum who runs Luniform and is a very humble artist, and join with Jan Hartman, who's a publisher. So it's going to be a really interesting conversation next week. So come on back, and thanks for being here. And thank you, Ken and Karen.